At age 50, Vladimir Guerrero is remembered as one of the rarest phenomena that American baseball has ever witnessed. A hitter who made all conventional rules meaningless. He was a 9-time All-Star, the 2004 American League MVP, an 8-time Silver Slugger winner, and he finished his career with a 318 batting average, 449 home runs, and thousands of hits that forced pitchers to completely change the way they threw. He was the soul of the Montreal Expos during the years that team still existed, then became an icon for the Los Angeles Angels when he led the team into an era of glory before closing out his career with the Texas Rangers and Baltimore Orioles. Vladimir Guerrero hit balls outside the strike zone, balls low near the ground, balls that seemed impossible to hit, and turned them into moments that made entire stadiums explode. In 2018, when his name was called at the Hall of Fame, it wasn't just recognition for a great player. It was an acknowledgement that baseball had once witnessed a pure, instinctive, unreplicable talent. But behind those dazzling numbers, behind the applause and the immortal statue, there is another half of the story that no stat sheet records. Because with every extraordinary swing came a part of his body quietly cracking. Every game a step closer to his own breaking point. At age 50, Vladimir Guerrero wakes up with his right shoulder stiff and aching, not from one specific accident, but from decades of never stopping, never protecting himself. The man who once defeated baseball itself now has to think carefully about every simple movement, has to accept that the arm that was once his ultimate weapon no longer obeys him. Yet in that quiet physical decline, an unbreakable will still exists. Guerrero doesn't blame baseball, doesn't regret those reckless swings, doesn't deny the path he chose. He endures the pain the same way he endured poverty, pressure, and doubt, his entire life quietly, persistently, and without needing witnesses. That very will, the will that took him from a boy with nothing but a wooden stick to the pinnacle of the Hall of Fame, is still there, holding him steady in silence, as proof that Vladimir Guerrero didn't just conquer baseball with talent, but also with the ability to bear the price that greatness always demands. If the story of Vladimir Guerrero's journey and the price he paid touches you, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue diving deep into the untold chapters behind the spotlight. Don Gregorio isn't a place where people grow up with dreams. It's a place where people grow up with endurance. There, poverty isn't a phase, isn't a temporary circumstance to overcome. It's a permanent state, clinging to every roof, every dusty red road, every meager meal, and every child born who already understands they have no right to be weak. Vladimir Guerrero entered life in a space like that, where mornings didn't begin with, "Are you feeling okay today?" but with, "What can we get to eat today?" No one had time to listen to kids complain about being tired, and no one stopped to ask if a young arm hurt after hundreds of repeated swings. In Don Gregorio, pain wasn't named because naming it didn't make it disappear. People just learned to get used to it, the same way they got used to the heat, the hunger, and the absence of hope. Guerrero's childhood wasn't wrapped in care or ideas about physical safety. There were no coaches correcting every move, no sports doctors monitoring signs of overload, no one on the sidelines saying, "Stop, you're hurting yourself." If anything, there were only adults who were already used to enduring, watching kids play ball all day under the blazing sun and seeing it as normal because they had done the same. A child's body in Don Gregorio wasn't something to preserve for the future. It was the only tool to survive the present. And in that world, baseball wasn't a sport, much less entertainment. It was the only escape, fragile but clear, from the cycle of poverty. Guerrero picked up a bat when he was very young, not because someone spotted talent and wanted to nurture it, but because the bat was the only thing that gave the boy hope of leaving the village. Every hit wasn't just contact with the ball. It was a silent prayer that his life could turn in a different direction. He hit on rough patches of dirt, where every slip left scrapes on his skin, where young shoulders had to withstand twisting forces he didn't understand and no one explained. There, no one taught technique to protect the body. There was only one unwritten rule. If you can hit, you keep going. If you're tired, you deal with it. If you stop, you get left behind. It was in that environment that Guerrero learned the lessons that would follow him his whole life. Not through words, but through harsh experience. Hurt? Endure it, because complaining doesn't make the pain go away. Tired? Keep going, because resting means losing your chance. Stopping means losing not just one game, but your whole life. No one told him the body needs rest to recover, that talent needs protection to last. The only thing he was taught unconsciously but thoroughly was to keep going, no matter the cost. There were days Guerrero hit from morning until dark, not out of pure joy, but out of fear of being forgotten. In a community where hundreds of kids dreamed of the same escape, stopping even for one day could let someone else pull ahead. So he kept hitting, swinging with every ounce of strength in a body that hadn't finished growing, then lying down at night with aching pain that no one asked about. That pain gradually became familiar, like part of life, to the point where he could no longer tell what was a safe limit and what was dangerous territory. For Guerrero, if he could still stand, if he could still hold the bat, then he had to keep playing. That absence of the idea of rest carved itself deep into who Guerrero became. While other kids elsewhere were taught to listen to their bodies, Guerrero was taught that listening to your body was a luxury. He didn't grow up thinking pain was a warning signal. He grew up thinking pain was the normal price to pay. And when a child accepts that too early, they carry that belief into every later stage of life, even when they step onto brightly lit stadiums with tens of thousands cheering and millions watching on screens. Don Gregorio gave Guerrero what the world later called raw, instinctual talent, but it also took away something no one noticed at the time: the ability to protect himself. A child raised in poverty learns endurance better than recovery, and that very endurance, which helped Guerrero survive, which carried him out of that small village, quietly planted the seeds for a tragedy that would bloom many years later. Because when a person is never taught, they have the right to stop. Then when their body screams for rest, they don't know how to listen. Vladimir Guerrero's childhood had no moments of being cherished or sheltered. It was built from deprivation, from silence, from nameless pain and long days with no one checking in. But from that very place, a person was formed. A person who would step into baseball with everything he had, holding nothing back, calculating nothing, leaving no way out. And it was from that same place that his tragedy began, not with one big event, but with a habit ingrained in his blood. Keep going, even when the body can no longer take it. Guerrero didn't enter baseball through freshly painted academies, didn't stand in front of coaches with playbooks or modern measuring equipment. His teenage years passed on empty dirt fields, where the foul lines were faint dust streaks, and the ball was worn from too many hands passing it. There, the concept of sports science didn't exist. No biomechanics of the swing, no safe limits for a developing shoulder joint. No one told Guerrero that the human body has a lifespan, that repeated motions would leave consequences, because in Don Gregorio, they didn't teach how to last long, they only taught how to make it through today. Guerrero hit every pitch, not because he was reckless, not because he wanted to defy the game's rules, but because that was the only way to be seen. In an environment where hundreds of boys held bats with the same fragile hope, skipping one pitch meant disqualifying yourself from the game. If you don't hit, you don't get picked. If you don't get picked, you go back to the old path: hunger, manual labor, and dreams buried before they can form. So, Guerrero hit everything, no distinguishing good pitches from bad, no weighing height or distance, only knowing that every swing was a matter of survival. There was no coach behind him fixing his stance, no one stopping him to say that swing was wearing down his right shoulder. Flaws in technique weren't seen as problems, because immediate results always overshadowed long-term consequences. When Guerrero connected, all eyes turned to him, cheers erupted, and the world around seemed to temporarily forget how he had swung. A technical flaw, if it produced results, wasn't corrected. Gradually, those very flaws became his identity, became what the world later called Guerrero's style. That boy didn't understand that his body was learning dangerous habits. For Guerrero, the body was just a tool, and that tool had to work non-stop if it wanted to be kept. Every day, he swung hundreds of times, repeating the same powerful twisting motion while his joints and muscles hadn't finished developing. There was no concept of recovery, no real days off. When tired, he just switched hands on the bat. When in pain, he adjusted his stance a little, but he never fully stopped. Stopping, in Guerrero's mind, was a luxury for people with other options. It was precisely in the absence of that guidance and protection that Guerrero's talent grew in a wild way. It wasn't shaped, wasn't refined for longevity. It was nurtured by unconscious repetition and survival pressure. He learned to trust reflexes over technique, instinct over strategy. Every successful hit reinforced the belief that his current way was right, that his body could take more, that no change was needed. And so a loop formed. Hit, succeed, keep hitting, ignore the pain, then hit again. Those around him saw something miraculous in Guerrero. They saw a boy who could hit pitches others wouldn't dare try, a rare phenomenon that left opponents bewildered and crowds thrilled. But they didn't see, or didn't want to see, the quiet price being paid. Because in that world, talent was always prioritized over health, and short-term results always drowned out long-term warnings. Guerrero was praised, noticed, pushed forward, but no one asked how long his body could sustain that path. Gradually, hitting every pitch stopped being a choice and became a reflex. Guerrero didn't need to think. His body reacted automatically to every pitch, as if programmed never to miss any opportunity. And that very reflex, the thing that made him different, was also what locked him into a style with no escape. When a habit forms from survival, it's not easily broken, even when circumstances change. Guerrero carried that habit into every higher level, into bigger stadiums, where the consequences of each technically flawed swing were no longer fleeting pains, but a gradual wearing down of an entire arm. Vladimir Guerrero's tragedy didn't begin when he stepped into big-league stadiums or when his name appeared on stat sheets. It began much earlier, from the days without academies, without coaches, without anyone teaching that talent also needs protection. What the world later called genius was actually built on a fragile foundation, where survival mattered more than sustainability. And when a boy learns to hit every pitch to survive, then many years later, the man will have to face the consequences of never being taught how to stop. When scouts first saw Vladimir Guerrero, what they witnessed wasn't a boy learning baseball. It was an untamed, natural reflex. His swing didn't follow any textbook, didn't match any technical model they'd ever charted. Low balls, high balls, balls outside the strike zone, balls that seemed pointless, all could be hit with a movement that was almost pure instinct. Scouts whispered to each other with voices mixed with awe and excitement because they knew they were standing in front of something rare. But in that excitement, one thing no one did. No one stopped to ask what that boy's body was enduring. There was no analysis of the stress his right shoulder was bearing through every swing. No one measured how many degrees his spine twisted each time he swung with full force. There was no conversation about the endurance limits of a still-developing body. Those questions didn't come up not because they weren't important, but because they didn't deliver quick answers the way long hits did. In the scouting world, what was hunted was immediate results, the ability to make an instant difference, and Guerrero delivered that perfectly. So, he was brought into the professional system not as a body that needed nurturing, but as an efficient tool that needed exploiting. No one said his style had to change because that style was bringing success. No one said he had to slow down because slowing down meant possibly missing something valuable. Guerrero was encouraged to do what he'd been doing since he was a kid: keep hitting. And as every hit reinforced his reputation, questioning the price he was paying gradually became unnecessary. In that system, talent came before protection. Reflexes were celebrated, while sustainability was something to figure out later. Guerrero wasn't taught how to prolong his career. He was taught indirectly that if what you're doing works, keep doing it until you can't anymore. No one stood on the sidelines saying the human body isn't an infinite machine, that high-intensity repeated motions would leave consequences. Any warnings, if they existed, were drowned out by applause and enthusiastic reports. Guerrero moved through every level with the same style, the same instinct, and the same belief, formed back in Don Gregorio. If you can still hit, then you have to hit. The MLB system welcomed him with admiration, but also with the familiar indifference of a giant machine. It knew how to spot talent, how to bring that talent into the light, but it didn't always know how to protect the person behind it. And Guerrero, who had never been taught he had the right to question his body, didn't ask for it either. Long practices, back-to-back games, seasons stacked on top of each other, all happened in a relentless cycle that no one actively slowed down. Guerrero kept swinging with the same intensity, the same decisiveness, while his body gradually learned to endure rather than recover. Small pains were ignored, signs of fatigue were treated as normal, because in the culture of that system, pain wasn't a reason to stop, it was proof you were working hard enough. The irony is that this very lack of protection was disguised under the name respecting instinct. People said not to fix Guerrero, not to intervene too much, because what made him special was the freedom in his approach. And so the line between respecting talent and neglecting the body blurred. No one intentionally harmed him, but no one took responsibility for protecting him from the very path they were encouraging. Throughout that time, Guerrero didn't feel mistreated. He just did what he'd always done: play ball with everything he had. He didn't demand special care, didn't complain about pain, didn't ask for more rest, because for him, being on the field at all was already an enormous privilege, and that privilege always came with the duty to keep going. That duty sank so deep that he could no longer distinguish where the limit to stop was, where the line not to cross lay. And so a body that had never been taught how to last long stepped into the harshest phase of a professional career. The swings were still beautiful, the hits still left people stunned, but behind them was the quiet accumulation of stress and damage. Each passing season wasn't just another line in the stats, it was another layer of fatigue piling onto joints and bones. The body's reminders grew clearer, but the survival habit formed in childhood still whispered one single command: keep going. When talent comes before protection, when effectiveness is placed above sustainability, tragedy doesn't arrive as a sudden collapse. It forms slowly, almost invisibly, covered by the glow of success. Vladimir Guerrero kept walking that path, celebrated, pushed higher, unaware that the absence of those basic questions: how much stress is the shoulder taking, how far is the spine twisting, was quietly writing an ending that, many years later, he would face in silence. When Vladimir Guerrero fully entered the MLB world, the first thing the system did wasn't to question his limits, it was to give him a name: bad ball hitter. A title that sounded both admiring and delighted, as if it were a rare magic trick. Balls outside the strike zone, low enough to nearly graze the dirt, high enough to seem pointless, all could be hit by Guerrero with a method that belonged to him alone. Pitchers began to fear him, not because of his strategy, but because of the uncertainty. They didn't know how to throw safely anymore, because no zone was truly out of reach for that bat. And every time Guerrero turned a bad pitch into a beautiful hit, the entire stadium erupted in excitement. The fans loved it. Television loved it. MLB loved it. A player who broke the logic of the game was always a gift to entertainment, and Guerrero became the perfect embodiment of that thrilling chaos. Every swing carried the feeling that baseball still had room for miracles, that there were still people who couldn't be boxed in by stats or textbooks. Highlights played on repeat, excited commentary rang out, and bad ball hitter quickly became a symbol of a talent that needed no explanation. But in that intoxication, one thing stood out. No one stopped him. No one stepped out of the circle of praise to ask what his body was enduring. No one stood in front of Guerrero and said plainly that each reckless swing was wearing down his right shoulder, twisting his spine, taking away bit by bit his ability to last long, because saying that would mean touching something the system didn't want to touch. Responsibility. MLB wasn't short on analytics departments, wasn't short on numbers, wasn't short on experts who understood athlete biomechanics. But in Guerrero's case, everyone seemed to look the other way. People said not to fix him, that fixing Guerrero would kill what made him special, and so respecting instinct became the perfect excuse to avoid the duty of protection. No one deliberately ignored him, but the entire system collectively chose silence, because that silence allowed the miracle to keep happening. Pitchers were terrified, but they weren't the ones who had to take the pain home after every game. Fans were thrilled, but they weren't the ones waking up in the morning with a stiff shoulder and an aching back. The cheers rose and faded, but Guerrero was the only one carrying the consequences, and it was in that imbalance that the systemic tragedy began to take clear shape. The benefits were shared widely, but the price was handed entirely to one person. Guerrero, loyal to the instinct formed in childhood, didn't question it himself. He didn't ask anyone to protect him, didn't seek intervention. For him, playing at the highest level was already a victory far beyond what the boy from Don Gregorio had ever dared to dream. And as each swing brought results, he had even fewer reasons to doubt the path he was on. The system saw an effective player, a phenomenon that drew crowds, and so both sides moved forward, each for their own reasons. The unspoken truth was that the line between admiration and neglect had been blurred. When a player is praised for hitting every pitch, asking him to stop or change becomes something emotionally and business-wise hard to accept. Guerrero became part of the story MLB told the world, the story of difference, of genius, of the wild beauty of the game. But in that story, there was no chapter about the nights of aching pain, about the lingering fatigue, about the body slowly sending faint cries for help that were ignored. No one dared tell Guerrero he was destroying himself, because saying that would mean admitting the system was profiting from that self-destruction. And so, the applause continued. The cameras kept rolling. The articles kept being written, while uncomfortable questions were ignored. MLB loved the phenomenon, but that phenomenon also became a mirror, reflecting an uncomfortable truth, that when a talent brings too much value, the responsibility to protect the person behind it often gets pushed to the bottom of the list. Guerrero still stepped onto the field, still swung with every ounce of strength, still did the things that left opponents stunned and fans mesmerized. But each time, his body paid another portion of the price that no one stepped up to take on his behalf. The tragedy didn't explode in a single moment. There was no loud snap to jolt everyone awake. It accumulated slowly, covered by the glow of success and the excitement of the crowd. By then, bad ball hitter was no longer just an interesting nickname, it had become a symbol of a deep contradiction, a system that celebrated difference to the point of willingly turning a blind eye to its consequences. And in that contradiction, Vladimir Guerrero kept moving forward, hailed as a living miracle, while the systemic tragedy quietly grew behind him, waiting for the day it could no longer be ignored. If MLB was a giant machine always running on efficiency and profit, then the Montreal Expos was a rare exception for Vladimir Guerrero. It wasn't just the first team to give him a chance. It was the only place in his entire career that made him feel he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. In Montreal, Guerrero wasn't seen as a phenomenon to be exploited to the maximum, nor was he pressured to become a media figure. He could be himself, a quiet player who hit by instinct, showed up, played, and went home in silence. The city wasn't overly glamorous. The stands weren't always packed. The TV lights didn't shine as harshly as in bigger markets. But it was in that simplicity that Guerrero, for the first time in his life, felt something very fragile and very rare: the feeling of belonging. The Expos became the only place in MLB where Guerrero didn't feel out of place. The clubhouse didn't demand he become someone else. The fans didn't need him to talk much or play the hero role, and the local press didn't turn every move into sensational headlines. There, his unusual swings were accepted. His silence was accepted. The way he walked slowly off the field with the dull ache in his shoulder was accepted. Montreal didn't ask him to become any kind of icon. It just asked him to show up and play ball. For someone who grew up in deprivation and always had to prove his worth, that meant more than any title ever could. That's why, when rumors started circulating that the Expos might be wiped out, Guerrero didn't see it as just business. For him, it was the familiar unease from childhood, the feeling that the one thing he clung to could be taken away at any moment. But just like so many times before in his life, Guerrero didn't voice that fear. He kept playing, kept swinging, kept delivering moments that made fans forget the fragile reality waiting just behind. Then what no one wanted to believe happened. The Expos were eliminated, not with a formal ceremony or an emotional farewell, but with cold administrative decisions. There was no final night to say goodbye, no season-ending honor, no moment for those attached to the team to realize what they were about to lose. The team vanished from the MLB map as if it had never existed, leaving a nameless void in the hearts of those who had seen it as home. For Guerrero, the shock wasn't loud, but it was deep. He didn't protest publicly, didn't make angry statements, didn't stand in front of cameras to express the injustice. He just quietly accepted it, because his whole life had trained him to accept losses beyond his control. But that silence didn't mean it didn't hurt. The Expos wasn't just where he started his career. It was the only place that ever gave him a sense of safety in a world that always demanded more from his body and his instincts. When the Expos disappeared, Guerrero lost the only emotional anchor he had in MLB. He was thrust into a new cycle, new cities, new expectations, brighter lights, heavier pressures. But none of those places gave him the feeling of being himself the way Montreal had. That loss didn't show up in the stat sheets, wasn't mentioned in career summaries, but it left a quiet crack in who Guerrero was. In Montreal, Guerrero played with the belief that no matter what happened on the field, he belonged there. When that belief was stripped away, he entered the rest of his career with a completely different feeling, the sense that everything was temporary, that no place was truly home. And when a player no longer feels he belongs, they often have only one way to survive: play ball with whatever they have left, because they don't know what else to do. The loss of the Expos made Guerrero cling even tighter to the only thing he could control: his bat and his instincts. He didn't try to build new emotional ties with another team, didn't learn to put down roots in a new place. Instead, he carried that emptiness with him and filled it with harder swings, greater efforts, as if playing to exhaustion was the only way not to face the feeling of being abandoned. Every game after that carried a different meaning. Not just competing, but a way to keep himself from falling into the void Montreal left behind. Guerrero's tragedy in this phase wasn't the trade itself. It was losing the only place that ever made him feel safe. When that team was erased, he didn't just lose a uniform, he lost a part of his own identity. And like so many times before in his life, Guerrero didn't allow himself to stop and grieve. He kept moving forward, carrying that loss as an inseparable part of who he was. Montreal left without goodbye, and Guerrero left without a choice. No one asked if he was ready. No one gave him time to accept it. That quiet, decisive stripping away left a deeper mark than any physical injury. Because from that moment on, Guerrero understood that in MLB, just like in life, even the place where you feel you belong most can vanish in an instant. And when that happens, the only thing left to hold on to, once again, is the ability to endure and keep walking, no matter the price. After Montreal vanished from the baseball map, Vladimir Guerrero stepped into a phase that seemed like the well-deserved reward for all the years of endurance that came before. In 24, in the colors of the Los Angeles Angels, he reached the peak any player dreams of, the American League MVP award. Dazzling numbers flooded the newspapers. Highlights played on repeat. Praise filled the airwaves. People talked about an all-powerful Guerrero, an unstoppable hitter, a phenomenon who changed the course of every game with a single swing. To the public, this was the familiar fairy tale, a player from poverty who overcame every barrier to stand at the top of the baseball world. But amid all that celebration, there was one truth that never made it into any frame. In the clubhouse, after the camera lights went out, Guerrero didn't celebrate the way people imagined. He sat quietly, right shoulder wrapped tightly in an ice pack, breathing deep and heavy. The pain wasn't new, but it had become more persistent, like an uninvited companion that always showed up exactly when the body needed rest the most. Back-to-back games, relentless swings, and each time his shoulder reminded him it had been used too long, too much, and listened to too little. But Guerrero said nothing. He had never been one to complain, and he certainly wasn't going to break the perfect picture the whole world was enamored with. The media called 24 the season of glory. They talked about power, about hitting balls outside the strike zone, about the fear pitchers felt facing him. But no one talked about the evenings. Guerrero went home with an arm that felt like lead, having to use his other hand to lift his shoulder onto the bed. No one talked about the mornings he woke up feeling stiff, taking many minutes just to move smoothly. Those details didn't fit the victory story, so they were left out. In the rare moments alone, Guerrero began to feel clearly the paradox of his life. He was standing at the absolute peak of his career, yet his body was sending increasingly alarming signals. Every successful game seemed to take away a piece of his strength that no one saw. Every round of applause was a reminder that he had to keep going, that stopping now would betray everything he had built. And so he kept going, because his whole life had trained him not to stop, no matter the cost. Guerrero understood that the MVP wasn't just a personal honor. It was the system's recognition of the path he had walked. But he also understood, deep in his silence, that his body was paying the price for that recognition. In the clubhouse, while teammates laughed and talked, while coaches discussed next game strategy, Guerrero often sat still, letting the ice pack slowly melt on his shoulder, like a familiar ritual. That wasn't a moment of weakness. It was the moment he allowed himself to feel what had been suppressed throughout the game. No one forced Guerrero to take the field when he was in pain, but no one really gave him a reason to stop either. In MLB's winning culture, pain was often seen as part of the job, as proof that you had given enough. And Guerrero, who had learned that since he was a child in Don Gregorio, didn't question it. He carried that pain with him as an inseparable part of his career, believing that if he just endured a little longer, everything would be fine. Those around him saw a strong, resilient Guerrero, always ready to play. But they didn't see the moments when he quietly wondered if he was trading too much. Those thoughts usually came at night, when the cheers had faded, when the MVP trophy sat silently in the room. Guerrero never had the habit of sharing those doubts. He kept them to himself, the same way he kept every other pain. 24 closed with applause and near absolute admiration. To the world, it was proof that Vladimir Guerrero had conquered baseball. But to him personally, it was also the year that marked an invisible line had been crossed. The right shoulder was no longer something he could trust completely. Every swing began to carry a quiet, hidden worry, even though he never let it show. The central paradox of Guerrero's life became clearer than ever. His greatest victory happened side by side with the silent breakdown of his body. When people talked about the peak, he felt the deep abyss opening beneath his feet. When they praised his power, he felt the growing fragility more clearly. But Guerrero didn't allow himself to stare at that paradox for too long. He turned back to the only thing he knew: keep playing, keep enduring, keep silent. In the clubhouse, the ice pack was placed on the shoulder again, the pain spread slowly again, and Guerrero sat there alone amid the glory. No tears, no complaints, just one truth no title could erase. His body was slowly paying the full price for all the years it never knew rest. And while the world was still intoxicated with the image of an unbeatable MVP behind the clubhouse door, Vladimir Guerrero was quietly breaking, silently fracturing bit by bit, right in the most glorious moment of his life. What the fans saw only ended when the game was over, when the stadium lights went out and the highlights were edited down for the evening news. But for Vladimir Guerrero, everything really began after that. In the long nights that were never filmed, when the clubhouse door closed, when the cheers dissolved, he carried the pain home like familiar luggage. The right shoulder throbbed dully, not the immediate ache after heavy exertion anymore, but a deep, slow-spreading pain, as if every muscle fiber was whispering that they had gone too far. Guerrero lay down in bed, but sleep didn't come. Every time he turned, the pain reminded him that this body no longer recovered the way it used to. The night passed in a half-awake, half-dreaming state, where he counted time by the rhythm of the pain instead of by the clock. Insomnia became part of his rhythm, not because of worry about tomorrow's game, but because the body wouldn't let him forget what it was enduring. Guerrero didn't turn on the light, didn't reach for sleeping pills. He just lay still in the dark, accepting the feeling as inevitable. He had grown used to enduring since he was a child, and now that endurance had simply shifted to a different, more subtle, more prolonged form. Every sleepless night was one more night. The body quietly accumulated fatigue, but also one more night he reminded himself that tomorrow morning he still had to take the field. The scariest thing wasn't the pain, it was the thought of stopping. In Guerrero's mind, stopping was always tied to loss. Stopping meant missing one game, missing a few games, and maybe losing his spot. Stopping meant giving someone else the chance to take his place. And in a league that ran on fierce competition, that chance might never come back. Guerrero had seen it happen to others, had heard the stories of players who rested because of injury and gradually disappeared from the lineup. That fear didn't need anyone to plant it in his head. It had existed since the days in Don Gregorio, where stopping meant being left behind. So Guerrero didn't dare rest. Even when his shoulder hurt so much that every swing came with a burning sensation, he still took the field. He convinced himself that he just needed to endure a little more, that the body would be fine, that this pain would pass like the times before. Every morning after a nearly sleepless night, he repeated the familiar ritual: slow stretching, heat, ice, then putting on the uniform as if it were part of himself. No one saw the hesitation in that moment, because Guerrero didn't allow it to show. The fear of being replaced wasn't vague. It lived in every small decision, every time he weighed whether to tell the coach about the pain or not. Guerrero understood that professional baseball didn't wait for anyone. Every day that passed, younger, stronger, hungrier players were waiting for their shot. And he, even as an MVP, even as an icon, wasn't exempt from that rule. Respect might exist, but the spot was always fragile. Thinking about that, Guerrero chose silence again. because silence allowed him to keep taking the field without facing the hard questions. In those sleepless nights, Guerrero began to realize a bitter truth. He no longer feared pain the way he once did, but he feared stopping more than ever. Pain, though uncomfortable, was still familiar, bearable, ignorable, but stopping meant facing uncertainty, the possibility of losing everything he had built. For someone who had risen from nothing, the thought of losing what he had was more terrifying than any physical pain. There were moments in the night when the shoulder hurt so much he had to sit up, that Guerrero quietly asked himself if he was trading too much. But that question was rarely followed to its end. He had learned to push it aside, the same way he pushed aside the body's other warning signals, because if he started listening, he feared he wouldn't be able to stop at just listening. And if he couldn't stop, then tomorrow he wouldn't take the field. That fear was strong enough to keep him on the familiar path. Even as that path grew narrower, those unfilmed nights were also where Guerrero faced his loneliness. When teammates were asleep, when the outside world no longer paid attention, he was left alone with his thoughts and his pain. No applause, no encouragement, just prolonged silence. But it was in that silence that Guerrero's will showed most clearly. He didn't try to escape the pain, didn't seek pity. He just prepared for the next day, for the next time on the field, as if that were the only thing he knew how to do. Vladimir Guerrero's tragedy wasn't that he hurt. It was that he didn't allow himself to stop because of the hurt. The fear of losing everything was greater than the fear of his body collapsing. And so he continued, through every sleepless night, through every exhausted morning, carrying the pain as part of his identity. The games went on, the swings still appeared on screens, and the world still believed he was fine. But behind the scenes, in those nights that were never filmed, Guerrero's real tragedy was quietly unfolding. A man fighting not against opponents, but against the very limits of his own body, so afraid of stopping that he was willing to endure anything to keep moving forward. There was no single moment Vladimir Guerrero could point to and say that everything started here. No fall, no horrifying snap, no ambulance ride, or flashing emergency lights in the middle of the night. The death of his right arm didn't come through big tragedy. It came through quiet erosion, happening day by day, swing by swing, like a lamp being slowly dimmed while no one noticed. After those sleepless nights of pain, Guerrero walked into every practice with the same routine, testing the shoulder's rotation, feeling how much it still obeyed today. And then he realized, day after day, that some things weren't coming back the way they used to. At first, it was just a feeling of heaviness. The shoulder could still lift the bat, still rotate, but it no longer felt smooth. The swing still went full range, but something was slower, caught for a very brief instant enough that only the person experiencing it noticed. Guerrero didn't say anything. He adjusted on his own, changed his stance angle, reduced force in some swings, but deep inside, a vague worry began to form. This body, the thing he had always trusted completely, was gradually setting new conditions. Then, the small things kept appearing. A practice where the shoulder hurt more than usual. A game where the pain didn't go away after icing. A morning waking up feeling like part of the arm's strength had been taken away overnight. No one around saw those as serious signs. In baseball, pains like that were commonplace. And Guerrero, who had learned to see pain as normal since childhood, didn't think otherwise. He continued, because continuing was the only reflex he knew. The frightening part of this decline was that it wasn't dramatic enough to force anyone to stop. If there had been a big accident, a clear injury, perhaps Guerrero would have been forced to rest, forced to face reality. But here, everything happened in the gray zone. The shoulder still worked, just a little worse. Every day, that little grew bigger. And in that gray zone, Guerrero chose to move forward, because stopping when you weren't forced to stop was always the hardest thing. Gradually, He began to realize that there were pitches he could no longer catch up to the way he used to. The reflexes were still there. The intent was still clear, but the body no longer responded as quickly. That was the moment of deep disorientation, because it struck directly at what had made Guerrero who he was: absolute trust in instinct and body. When the body started lagging behind the mind, a dangerous gap opened. Guerrero didn't talk about that gap to anyone. He just withdrew inward, trying to fill it with experience and will. Outsiders might see his performance changing, see some numbers no longer as brilliant as before, but they didn't see the process happening inside, where every tendon, every shoulder joint, was slowly losing its ability to endure. Guerrero felt the difference clearly every time he swung with full power. There were swings that made the pain flare up like a belated warning. There were moments he had to grit his teeth to keep his face calm, because admitting the pain meant opening the door he feared most, the door leading to having to stop. The death of Guerrero's right arm didn't happen in one day, but over hundreds of identical days. Each day, a small piece of function disappeared so small it could be ignored if you weren't paying attention. But added together, they formed an undeniable truth. The shoulder could no longer handle the old intensity. The body was no longer willing to sacrifice any more. Guerrero began to have to choose not between winning and losing, but between continuing in pain and facing his own limits. In that process, there was no funeral for the arm that once made his name. No one stopped to mourn the swings that once made entire stadiums hold their breath. There was no farewell ceremony for something that was slowly vanishing. Because in the world of elite sports, decline is rarely treated as a loss worthy of grief. It's only acknowledged once it's complete, once the player no longer appears the way he used to. Guerrero felt that loss every day, but he didn't allow himself to grieve. He had lived his entire life in the mindset of endurance, and even as his arm slowly died, he still tried to maintain that silence. There were practices where he left the field earlier, not because he was tired, but because he knew one more swing might be too much. There were games where he felt he was playing on muscle memory, not on what his body could actually still do. This decline carried a special kind of loneliness. No one could truly share the feeling of a part of your body, the thing that once defined you, gradually no longer belonging to you. Guerrero looked at his arm and saw a painful paradox. It was still there, still moved, but it was no longer the arm he once knew. It became something familiar yet strange, a part of the body but no longer a reliable ally. And so, in silence, Guerrero began to accept what could not be reversed. Not with one decisive decision, but through a series of small adjustments, by lowering expectations of himself, by listening to his body more even though it was already too late. His right arm didn't die in one dramatic moment. It died gradually, swing by swing, season by season, until its absence became clearer than its presence. That funeralless death marked the physical climax of Guerrero's life. No one stood up to applaud. No one bowed their head in silence. But to him personally, it was the end of a lifelong relationship, the relationship between a man and his own body. And in the emptiness left behind by that quiet departure, Guerrero was forced to face the question he had avoided for so many years. If that arm was gone, who would he be? After the slow death of his right arm, the inevitable finally arrived, but not in the way Vladimir Guerrero had ever imagined. There was no moment standing in the middle of the field with prolonged applause, no wave to the crowd, no career tribute videos replaying everything. Guerrero's retirement wasn't a decision that was announced. It was a reality that gradually became obvious when his body no longer allowed him to continue. He didn't step forward and say he was ready to leave. His body stood up first, walking away from the game before his mind could even accept it. The final seasons passed in a hard-to-name limbo. Guerrero still wore the uniform, still took the field, but deep inside, a part of him understood that this couldn't last. Every game felt like a silent negotiation between will and body. The will said, Keep trying a little more, that a man like him couldn't end so quietly. But the body didn't negotiate. It responded with longer-lasting pain, with helplessness in moments that used to be so familiar, with refusal to do things that once required no thought. There was no farewell tour, because Guerrero never truly said goodbye. There was no ceremony, because he never actively chose a departure date. His career didn't close with a door gently shut. It closed slowly while he was still standing at the threshold. He still wanted to play, still believed he could contribute. But baseball at the highest level doesn't wait for personal wishes. When the body no longer responds, the only choice left is acceptance. The most painful part wasn't having to leave the field. It was losing the right to decide when that happened. Guerrero's entire life had revolved around one thing. If you can still stand, you have to keep going. But this time, for the first time, the decision was no longer in his hands. The body, which had served him faithfully for decades, now withdrew on its own. And Guerrero, who always believed he could endure just a little more, was forced to face the reality that some limits cannot be overcome by will. There was no final evening for him to look around the stadium and remember every detail. There was no moment to fully feel that he was closing a chapter of his life. Everything happened in a haze, making the loss even harder to name. Guerrero didn't cry in public, didn't show regret outwardly, but in silence, he felt the emptiness opening clearly. An emptiness that wasn't just the absence of baseball, it was the absence of the person he once was. For many years, Guerrero had been defined by showing up to play. His schedule, his rhythm of life, his reason for existing, all tied to this game. When it disappeared not on his terms, the disorientation became heavy. No one had taught him how to live when there was no next game to prepare for. No one guided him on how to face mornings without needing to put on a glove, without checking his shoulder before heading out. Retirement, for Guerrero, wasn't a well-deserved rest. It was a quiet stripping away. He walked off the grass the same way he had lived his entire career. Quietly. No resentment, no blame, but also no sense of completion. Because deep down, Guerrero knew he had never truly gotten to say goodbye. He left when he wasn't ready, when he still wanted to stand in the middle of the field, even just one more time. But baseball didn't grant him that privilege. Losing the right to decide his own life was a heavier mental blow than any injury. Guerrero had accepted pain, endured fatigue, sacrificed his body to keep going. But this time, he wasn't allowed to choose to sacrifice anymore. The right to choose was taken away, leaving a prolonged silence where he had to learn how to exist without the one thing that had given his life meaning. Retirement came to Vladimir Guerrero not as a carefully written final chapter, but as a sentence cut off midway. No period, no clear conclusion, just a truth that gradually became evident over time. Baseball left him before he could leave baseball. And in that silence, Guerrero began to step into the hardest phase of his life, not as an athlete, but as a man who had just lost the identity he had carried his whole life. When Vladimir Guerrero left the field in silence, his life didn't stay empty for long the way people might think, because at home there was a boy with the same name, the same eyes, and very soon the same bat in his hands. Vladimir Guerrero Jr. wasn't just a son, he was a mirror that the father couldn't turn away from. Every time he watched his son step into the batter's box, Guerrero, the father, didn't just see pride, he saw himself from many years earlier, a child who didn't know what limits were, who didn't understand rest, who only knew that if he didn't hit, there would be no way to survive. Fatherhood came to Guerrero later than his career. When he had a child, his body was already worn down. The pains had become familiar companions. He held his son with an arm that was no longer as strong as before, and in that moment, a new fear took shape. Not fear of pain, but fear of repetition. Fear that the child carrying his name would walk the exact same path he had walked. and pay the same price he had paid, bit by bit, in silence. But how do you warn a child without killing his dreams? Guerrero wasn't good with words. He had never been the type to stand in front of crowds and explain his emotions. Even with his son, he chose silence more than advice. He watched Guerrero Jr. practice, watched the swings grow stronger, more confident, and inside him mixed two opposing feelings. Pride, because his son had real talent, because the world was opening doors for him that he himself had once had to break down to walk through. But at the same time, fear, because he knew what lay behind those doors. Sleepless nights, ignored pains, years of using the body like a tool. That father didn't know how to tell his son to be careful, because he himself had never been careful with his own body. He couldn't stand in front of Guerrero Jr. and say, "Don't swing at everything," when his entire career had been built on exactly that. He couldn't say rest when it hurts, when he himself had played through pain his whole life. Any warning, if spoken, risked becoming a denial of who he was. And worse, it could strip the child of confidence, the most fragile, yet most necessary thing for a young talent. So, Guerrero chose a different way. He didn't stop his son from playing ball. He didn't impose his own dreams on him, nor did he extinguish his son's dreams. He was just there, watching, ready to step in when needed, but rarely interfering. That was the only kind of protection he knew how to give. Not taking up space, not adding pressure, not turning baseball into a family obligation. But deep down, he still carried a quiet guilt that his silence might not be enough. Every time he saw his son praised, noticed by the media, Guerrero felt a chill run down his spine. He had been there. He knew how quickly praise could turn into expectation, and how expectation could push a person past limits without them realizing it. He watched his son being called a phenomenon, a new generation, and in his head echoed the words once used about him many years earlier. History, he feared, might be preparing to repeat itself. Being a father in a state already worn down is an experience full of contradictions. Guerrero wanted to protect his son from what had hurt him, but he didn't want to become the bitter man standing on the sidelines of his son's life. He understood that baseball had given him a lot too: honor, opportunity, and the ability to change his family's fate. He couldn't deny that, but he also couldn't forget the price. And between those two truths, he stood quietly, trying to find a way to be a father without any model to follow. There were times, during quiet practices with few people around, when Guerrero simply stood and watched his son hit, saying nothing. His eyes were no longer those of a Hall of Famer. They were the eyes of a man who had walked the entire road and knew every pothole on it. He didn't tell his son that this road would hurt, because he knew his son wouldn't believe it until he felt it himself. Instead, he only hoped that when the pain came, his son wouldn't have to face it alone the way he once did. Trying to protect what he couldn't save in himself, that was the quiet tragedy of Guerrero in this phase of his life. He couldn't save his own body from the erosion of the years, but he still tried to preserve for his son one thing he had lost very early: the right to stop, to listen to himself, to choose differently if needed. He wasn't sure if he had done it right or not. He only knew that his love for his son didn't lie in loud advice, but in quiet presence standing behind him, ready, so that if his son stumbled, at least he wouldn't fall alone. And in that silence, father and son shared the same dream, but no longer the same innocence. Guerrero watched his son move forward, carrying his name, and understood that the only part he could control now wasn't the path his son took, but the way he stood beside him on that path with all the pride and all the fear that a father who had been worn down carried in his heart. When Vladimir Guerrero Jr. was announced as MVP, that moment didn't resemble any of the glorious moments the father had ever experienced. The bright stage lights, the swelling applause, the cameras pointed straight at the young man's smiling face. It all felt so familiar that Guerrero Sr. almost thought he was reliving part of his past. But this time, he wasn't standing in the batter's box. He stood on the sidelines as a father who had walked the full road that his son had just reached the top of. The tears came unexpectedly, not explosive tears of pure pride, but an emotion compressed for many years that finally found its way out. Guerrero Sr. bowed his head, covered his face with his hand, for a very brief moment, as if afraid someone might see the weakness he had never allowed himself to show his whole life. But he wasn't crying for the trophy. He was crying because he realized something else. His son had walked that road and was still standing. He remembered his own years, when victory always came with pain, when every award was another layer of ice on the shoulder, when joy was sliced thin by the fear that tomorrow he might not be able to take the field. He remembered the feeling of winning, but having no one to share the exhaustion behind it. And then he looked at his son, healthy, alert, surrounded by a system that understood more about the body, about recovery, about limits, not perfect, not immune to pressure, but with something he had lacked throughout his entire career: the right to be heard. Guerrero Sr. didn't say much that day. He didn't need to speak, didn't need to explain why he was crying. Those around him might think it was the pride of a father seeing his son reach the top. And that was true, but not enough. Because deep in his heart was a rare relief. The fear of repetition had stepped back, at least for now. Not gone completely, but far enough for him to allow himself to breathe. When the son won, the father finally dared to be weak, because only when he saw his son standing firm did he dare look back at himself. He dared to admit that the road he had walked had been very harsh, that what he called endurance had actually taken far too much. Before, if he showed weakness, he feared it would blur the image the world had assigned him, the man who hit every pitch, who never tired, who never hurt. But now, he no longer needed to hold that image. Because the legacy no longer lived in him, it was alive, breathing, smiling right in front of him. Guerrero Sr. watched his son receive the trophy and realized a simple but profound truth. The award was no longer the final destination. What mattered more was that his son had survived the road he once walked, not just survived in the stat sheets, but survived as a human being, not trading everything in silence, not forced to be strong to the point of self-destruction, not carrying the fear of stopping greater than the fear of pain. In that moment, he allowed himself to cry for everything that had passed. Cry for the arm that died gradually without a funeral. Cry for the sleepless nights, for the mornings waking up with a stiff shoulder, for the times he took the field when he should have rested. And cry for himself, the man who never knew how to protect himself, but in the end had protected the most important thing. There were no words spoken between father and son right then. They didn't need any. The look they exchanged said enough. The son saw the quiet pride of his father. The father saw the steadiness of his son. Between them was no longer just the relationship of two people with the same name. It was the bond of two generations, where one had gone before and one was continuing, but not necessarily in the same way. Pride finally allowed to cry. That wasn't the collapse of a once strong man, it was release. Guerrero Sr. no longer had to prove anything to the world. He had witnessed the hardest thing, his son winning without being swallowed whole, and in that victory he found belated comfort for all the irrecoverable losses. When the ceremony ended, when the stage gradually emptied, Guerrero Sr. lingered a little longer. He took a deep breath, wiped away the remaining tears, and smiled a smile that needed no cameras. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel the need to brace himself, because somewhere on that field, a better version of the road he once walked was continuing. And for him, that was the greatest victory. When Vladimir Guerrero stepped onto the Hall of Fame stage in 2018, the baseball world called it an immortal moment. His name was etched into the place reserved for the greatest, those who shaped the history of the sport. The applause rang long and solemn. Familiar faces smiled. Speeches recounted unimaginable swings, brilliant seasons, moments that made entire stadiums hold their breath. From the outside, it was the perfect ending to an extraordinary journey. But from the inside, Guerrero knew clearly that immortality didn't bring healing. He stood there, his tailored suit hiding a body that had paid the full price. The right shoulder was still there, but it was no longer the shoulder that had once defeated baseball itself. No pitch was fully intact, no movement completely free. Every handshake, every wave carried an unconscious calculation not to avoid pain entirely, but to control it. The Hall of Fame honored what he had achieved, but it couldn't give back what had been lost. Guerrero listened to the praise for his endurance, his power, his ability to push past every limit. He heard his own story retold in heroic tones, polished to fit under the lights. But amid those words, he also heard the gaps. No one mentioned the sleepless nights, the stiff mornings, the years of taking the field when the body begged to stop. Not because people deliberately forgot, but because those things didn't belong to the ritual of enshrinement. Immortality in baseball is a beautiful concept. It promises that what you did won't be erased by time. But Guerrero understood that immortality didn't mean healing. His name would live forever on the bronze plaque, but his arm would not. The swings would be replayed forever, but the body that performed them existed only in memory. There was a profound paradox in that. The more he was celebrated for what he sacrificed, the more those sacrifices could never be reclaimed. In his speech, Guerrero didn't talk much about the pain. He thanked his family, his teammates, thanked baseball for the chance to change his life. Those were sincere words, but also safe ones. How do you talk about the real price of glory on a day designed to celebrate? How do you tell that behind the immortality was a body that would never be the same again? Guerrero chose silence, not out of denial, but because he had lived long enough with that truth not to need to prove it anymore. As the ceremony continued, he looked around and saw the faces of those who had walked similar roads. There were knowing eyes, very slight nods, as if they were acknowledging something that didn't need to be said. The Hall of Fame wasn't just a place of victories, it was also a gathering of bodies worn down in different ways. The difference was only in who could still hide it and who could not. Guerrero smiled at the crowd, but inside he felt a strange mix of pride and emptiness. He had reached what the boy from Don Gregorio never dared dream of, but that boy had also never been warned about what he would have to trade. Immortality came late, when the body was already gone, when standing on the field was only memory, and memory, no matter how beautiful, couldn't soothe the present pain. After the induction, when the applause had died down, Guerrero returned to everyday life. No more schedules, no more pressure to take the field. But the body still carried the marks of a life without rest. There were days he felt okay, and days when even a small movement reminded him that his career had never truly left. The Hall of Fame didn't end the story with baseball. It only closed the playing chapter, leaving the long aftermath chapter behind. Immortality without healing, that is the paradox Guerrero lives with. He was honored for pushing past human limits, but he has to live with the consequences of pushing past those limits. And even so, he harbors no resentment. He understands that baseball doesn't promise fairness, it only promises opportunity. He seized that opportunity with his entire body. Looking back, Guerrero doesn't seek pity. He doesn't want his story to become a complaint, but he also doesn't want it to be just a one-dimensional hero saga. The Hall of Fame recognizes achievements, but the real story of his life lies elsewhere in the endurance, in the choices that weren't really choices, in continuing when stopping seemed even more terrifying than the pain. Immortality, in the end, isn't about being remembered forever. For Guerrero, immortality is accepting that the body may never heal, but the person inside still stands firm. He stepped down from the induction stage with a slow walk, carrying that truth the same way he carried everything else in his life, quietly, without show, and fully aware of the price he had paid. At age 50, Vladimir Guerrero no longer wakes up with the anticipation of a game, no longer prepares his body for 9 tense innings, but he still wakes up with one thing that never left: the pain. It isn't as fierce as an acute injury, isn't as loud as tragedy. It's quiet and persistent, like an uninvited companion. The right shoulder stiffens every morning, the back reacts to movements that seem harmless, and the simplest actions, lifting an arm high, turning quickly, require careful consideration. His body no longer allows impulsiveness. Every movement has to pass through a new layer of awareness. Is this worth paying another portion of pain? Chronic pain doesn't arrive to demand attention. It exists in the background, quietly reshaping the rhythm of life. Guerrero learned to live more slowly, not because he wanted to, but because his body forced him to. Light exercises, carefully chosen stretches, longer breaks between activities, all became part of a routine that never appeared on any stat sheet. There are days he feels okay, enough to forget for a while. There are days when just a change in the weather is enough to stir the pain, reminding him that his career never truly ended. It just changed form. Limited mobility isn't just a physical story. It carries a very personal kind of sadness. When someone who once lived through movement now has to negotiate every step, Guerrero doesn't complain about it. He understands that his body did far too much in the past, and now it's simply reclaiming what's owed. There's no resentment toward baseball, toward the system, or toward himself. Resentment doesn't make the pain disappear, and he has lived long enough to know that. Instead, there is acceptance, not the kind of surrender, but clear-eyed acceptance, fully aware of the limits and living within them. There is a strange calm in the way Guerrero faces the present. He doesn't try to polish the past, nor does he deny the price paid. When asked about his playing years, he speaks in an even tone, neither overly excited nor bitter. The great swings remain beautiful memories, but they don't overshadow the reality of today. And today, for him, is about learning to live peacefully with his body, listening to it more than he ever did before. Living with pain is also learning to choose different joys. Guerrero spends more time with family, with moments that require no proof of anything. He doesn't need to take the field to feel valuable. That value now lies in presence, in being able to stand on the sidelines and watch his son grow, in still being able to smile, even though the pain never fully goes away. There are afternoons when he simply sits still, letting his body rest, and that, for someone who once didn't know what rest was, is a small but real victory. Chronic pain also brought something Guerrero never had during his career: patience with himself. Before, he measured everything by immediate results. Now he measures by the ability to sustain. No need to be better than yesterday, just not worse. No need to push past limits, just not betray the body again. That is a new philosophy of living, written not in words, but in every pain that reminds him. Some people ask if he has regrets. Guerrero often stays silent before that question. Regret is a complicated concept when looking back on a life that changed the fate of an entire family. Without those years, he wouldn't be here. Without those swings, he wouldn't have given his son different opportunities. But if he could choose again, would he do it differently? He doesn't answer, because life doesn't allow hypothetical experiments. The only thing he can do is live well with what remains. At age 50, Guerrero no longer chases immortality. He already has his name on the bronze plaque, already has the applause of the whole world. Those things stay behind. Ahead of him are days that need to be arranged around his body, around the pain, around the new limits. And in the way he accepts that, there is no melodrama, just the bare truth. The pain is permanent, but it isn't his entire being. Pain as a permanent companion, an unwelcome but familiar friend. Guerrero no longer fights it. He learns to walk alongside it, adjusting his breathing, adjusting his expectations, adjusting the way he sees himself. Some things never heal, and he has stopped waiting for miracles. Instead, there is a different kind of peace, one that comes from knowing he has gone far enough, paid enough of a price, and now has the right to slow down without asking anyone's permission. In that acceptance, there is a quiet dignity. Guerrero is no longer the phenomenon, no longer the MVP, no longer the man who terrified pitchers. He is a 50-year-old man, living with the consequences of the very glory he once created. And perhaps that is the hardest chapter, not because it hurts, but because it demands a different kind of courage. The courage to stop, to listen, and to live fully with what will never heal. At age 50, Vladimir Guerrero doesn't stand in front of the mirror to look back at a legend. He stands in front of the mirror to check what his body allows him to do today. Not to swing, not to throw far, but to live an ordinary day without paying another portion of pain. His life didn't close with a moment of redemption. There is no resurrection, no belated miracle to repair what was lost. Just a man walking on, carrying a body that paid the full price for years that never knew rest. Vladimir Guerrero didn't defeat baseball. He gave his entire body to it. Every swing, every stride, every time he swallowed pain to keep taking the field, they were small cuts, adding up to a price he only fully saw when he stopped. No one forced him to sacrifice that much, but no one taught him any other way. He grew up in a world where stopping meant being left behind, where the body was only a tool to escape poverty, where tomorrow was always so fragile that thinking beyond today wasn't allowed. And baseball, with all its beauty and brutality, exploited that to the fullest. When people talk about Guerrero's legacy, they mention unimaginable hits. Balls outside the strike zone turned into historic moments, years that made pitchers afraid. But his true legacy isn't fully captured in footage or stat sheets. It lies in what was never shown: the sleepless nights, the stiff mornings, the times he took the field when the body had sent enough signals begging to stop. That is the price baseball rarely tells at the same time as the glory. There is no moment in this story where everything gets fixed, no ending where the body heals and the painful memories are erased. Vladimir Guerrero was not granted belated justice. He was not given back what was lost. And it is precisely that absence that makes his story real. Because in real life, success doesn't promise fair balance. It only promises opportunity, and the price depends on how much you're willing to sacrifice. Guerrero doesn't resent baseball. He never stood up to criticize the system, never turned his pain into an accusation. His silence isn't resignation, it's acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that he chose this path with everything he had at the time. Acknowledgement that he didn't know how to protect himself better. And acknowledgement that some choices in life are only fully understood when everything is over. At age 50, he no longer seeks applause. He has had enough. What he seeks now is days that require no proof of anything. Days he can spend with family. Days he can watch his son walk his own path, not as a copy, but as a different version, with more chances to stop, to listen, to choose. Guerrero's living legacy isn't a name being copied. It's a lesson passed on in silence. That talent needs protection. That passion shouldn't mean self-destruction. When he watches his son succeed, Guerrero doesn't see a resurrection for himself. He sees an adjusted continuation, a familiar road, but not necessarily traveled at the same price. And in that continuation, he finds a form of comfort that needs no miracle, not because what he lost was returned, but because what he lost doesn't have to be repeated exactly the same. Vladimir Guerrero's story isn't a warning against dreams. It is a reminder of the price of never being taught how to rest. For American audiences, in a society that glorifies non-stop effort and personal sacrifice, this story touches an uncomfortable truth. Success doesn't just take time. Sometimes it takes your body too. And the system will applaud when you give, but rarely stays when you need to take back. Guerrero gave everything he had not in one heroic moment, but in thousands of small, unseen moments. He gave when his body was still young, when instinct was stronger than knowledge, when the fear of poverty and being replaced was greater than the fear of pain. And when he had given enough, he stopped, not because he wanted to, but because there was nothing left to give. There is no miracle here, no final scene where he runs onto the field one more time, healthy and whole, just a 50-year-old man living with the consequences of glory, accepting that his body did far too much for one lifetime. And in that acceptance, there is a quiet dignity. The dignity of someone who walked the road he knew to the end, paid the full price, and doesn't need to justify it. He didn't beat baseball. He gave himself to it. He didn't conquer the sport to stand above it. He dissolved into it, let it shape him, wear him down, and ultimately left in him scars that will never heal. But it is from those very scars that a different legacy is born. Not the hits, not the awards, but the raw truth about the price of success. And as this story closes, there are no calls for tears, no false comfort, just an invitation to reflect that in your own pursuit of success, ask yourself, what are you giving away? And is anyone teaching you how to hold on to what is most essential? Because sometimes what you lose isn't time, isn't youth, it's your very body, the one thing that cannot be replaced, cannot be revived, and will never be given back when the story ends. The story of Vladimir Guerrero is not just the biography of a baseball legend. It is a quiet indictment of the real price of success in American society. There we see clearly layer after layer of tragedy piling up, from a child growing up in Don Gregorio, where poverty didn't allow rest, to an MLB player celebrated for hitting every pitch, while no one ever stopped to ask what his body was enduring. Details like the right shoulder in chronic pain from very early on, the unfilmed sleepless nights, or Guerrero icing in the clubhouse right in the middle of his 24 MVP season reveal a cruel paradox. The greatest glory built on silent collapse. The erasure of the Montreal Expos cut even deeper into the feeling of being stripped away, when Guerrero lost the only place that ever made him feel he belonged, forcing him to keep playing as the only way to survive. The physical climax came when his right arm died, gradually swing by swing. No accident, no funeral, ending in a retirement without a farewell tour, where he even lost the right to decide when to leave. More painful still is the image of the father watching Guerrero Jr. walk the old road, proud yet terrified, until he broke into tears when his son won MVP, not for the award, but because his son had survived where he himself had been worn down. For Americans, the lesson from this story is painfully real. Society glorifies effort, discipline, and sacrifice, but rarely teaches how to protect the body and human limits. Success, as Guerrero lived it, doesn't just take time. Sometimes it takes your very body. And the most sobering thought isn't how great he was, but whether we are learning how to succeed without offering ourselves up to the point where we can never heal again. Thank you for staying until the very last moment of this story. If the journey and the price Vladimir Guerrero paid have made you reflect, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue listening together to the truths behind the spotlight of American sports. See you in the next video, where we will keep telling not just about the legends, but about the real people standing behind that glory.